Welcome to Feelings and Other F Words. I'm Dr. Daryl Appleton. This week's F word is about feedback. Now, before you're like, Daryl, that's not sexy enough. That's not interesting enough. Hold on. Hold your horses. Because this word has literally brought organizations to their knees. It has literally been at the crux of what I have untangled in couples therapy. This word of feedback, how to give and receive it, nobody can even agree on. So when I was doing my notes and getting ready, I came across dozens upon dozens upon dozens of articles. I just want to read you their titles, right? This is where we're at with feedback. 9 tips for giving better feedback at work. How to give negative feedback to your peers. How to give negative feedback to your boss. How to give constructive feedback. Types of feedback in the workplace. How to give and receive feedback. 27 employee feedback examples and the right way to use them. Feedback as an act of love. How to transform storytelling. Criticism versus feedback. Why love is the secret for feedback and growth. Giving feedback that will strengthen your relationships. Giving your partner feedback without provoking a fight. Like, Lord, it is saturated. It is saturated. And it is quite literally one of the number one things that people reach out to me for from a consulting standpoint with their organizations or their teams or as a leader. And again, even in couples and relationships of how to have better conversations. Like that's what we're talking about. Feedback is this art of being able to give or have a conversation that may not go well, or that you're trying to communicate with somebody about something very specifically, and you have to do it delicately. It's like hostage negotiation sometimes. And a lot of times when we look at types of feedback or workplace or whatever, relationships, like feedback is industry agnostic in a lot of ways. It's relationship agnostic. It's not a matter of if you are going to have to give feedback at some point. It's a matter of when. And truly, we don't even know how to do it well. Like the research hasn't circled around one particular way to give feedback. We have more questions than answers. There's tons of studies on like how to give feedback to millennials versus Gen Zs versus industry, different industries, right? Age, gender, sexual orientation even. But yet we have yet to crack the code. Why? Well, in my humble opinion, it's because everybody's an individual and they are going to give and receive feedback very differently based on a whole host of, wait for it, psychological tendencies, upbringing, how their family defines feedback or gave feedback, or what criticism looks like in their life or doesn't. All of these things are captured in our rhetoric. So it is incredibly difficult to try to teach people how to give and receive feedback with formulas or even through research. Like, again, like when I was looking at all these theories and all of these like deep dives into the research, I came up with the 3 C's of feedback, the 4 A's of feedback, the 5 R's of feedback, 7 keys for feedback. And I'm not even kidding. I'm not even joking. I'm like, you can look that up. Those are all real things. And guess what? All of them are right and all of them are wrong. So what we do know, let's talk about this. For you out there that maybe you're in a leadership position, or maybe you're about to have your year-end review, or maybe you're in a place where you're just trying to understand how to communicate better with the people around you, personally, professionally. You're like, okay, what can I take from this then? Feedback's sounding not so sexy, but maybe a little bit more important than I first thought. I'm going to start with this. We do know with decades of research, one thing. We do know that teaching less and giving more feedback is better, right? We do know that for understanding, for growth, for development, sitting in front of somebody teaching, teach a man to fish kind of thing, right? Is not as helpful as letting a man fish and then giving him pointers or her or them, right? So I think that's a really interesting thing. And what you do with that needs to be context specific. But for this conversation, what I want to pivot and focus on a little bit more that I find to be incredibly important is the conversation that we need to have around goals and goal setting with strengths. So for instance, when you think of the word strength, a bunch of shit's going to come up. You're going to think about a bunch of different things. And I want you to take a second and like really ask yourself like, okay, what does strength mean? And maybe you might come up with words like resilient or literally like strong, able to carry. For some of you, strength is literally going to be whatever is anti-weakness. And for me, I think that strengths are something that are underutilized and hyper important when we're talking about feedback, when we're talking about performance, when we're talking about all of this different stuff. Now, a strength to me, and it's very Gallup of me, Gallup Consulting, Clifton Strengths is a real thing. And if you haven't taken it, I challenge you to be with the 37 million other people or wherever they're at who have taken it at this point to figure out what your strengths are, because I do very much believe that strengths can be superpowers. And I was watching a commencement speech not too long ago where the keynote speaker, who is a CEO, was talking about this, that strengths can absolutely be superpowers. Because when you work from your strengths, when you are giving and delivering feedback with your strengths, but also keeping other people's strengths in mind, all of a sudden we're having a different conversation. This isn't toxic positivity. This isn't always looking on the bright side. This is allowing ourselves to take the time, the extra second to frame our message. When I was playing basketball in college, I know there was like this thing drilled into our heads of like, take a second to set up your shot. This is no different. Knowing who's in front of you and how they need to be spoken to, or what the goal is and how to frame it to them, is incredibly, incredibly important for being a partner in a romantic capacity, a friend, a leader, a coworker, any and all of that. So I think that that's step one, is to understand what your strengths are as well as other people's strengths. Now, for me, my top strengths are strategic, futuristic, maximizer, significance, and relator, which means my brain does best looking at a macro picture and breaking it down into smaller things. It's what I do every day in therapy. It's what I do every day in consulting and advising, taking a big picture and breaking it down and finding a strategic way forward with the information that I have. And that's unique to me, how I just framed it. Strategy might look something different for someone else. Futuristic makes sense, looking forward, looking big picture. Maximizer means if I'm going to do something, I want to do it. I want to do it to the best of my ability. I want to maximize what we can do with this. Why are we going to settle for anything less? And the significant piece is I want this to matter. I'm a huge fan of efficiency, but also like purpose. I love purpose work. I love bringing it out in other people. I love doing it myself. Boring administrative tasks are literally the devil to me. Like, it's very hard. And then relator means I like to do deep work with people I care about and trust. And there's this, it's almost like the introvert in me, right? Like I want to have conversations that are meaningful and matter with people I can relate to and trust. So sometimes it takes a little bit to like pass through that barrier, but once you're in, you're in. And I remember coming out of my Clifton Strengths assessment, which is online, right? You take a bunch of questions that seem very random. It takes you about like 20 minutes, but you get your results instantaneously. And I remember being like, I feel so seen. This makes sense. This makes sense. And the reason that I'm boring you with this is for me now, I can utilize my strengths and I can help communicate to other people where I'm coming from when I'm using a certain tactic or why I'm doing a certain thing. So for instance, at home, when Jimmy and I, who has yet to take Clifton Strengths, but maybe for Christmas, that'll be a really wonderful, thoughtful gift for him. I'll get it. But we tackle things very differently, right? When there's a problem, I lean in and I want to figure it out. I want strategy there. I want to make sure our future's set. Like I am not leaving any stone unturned. For Jimmy, like he wants to take a step back, have a breather, allow for there to be a little bit more of like feeling better about it before we move forward. And again, I don't know what that strength would be, but it would be on there. I'm sure it would rank in the top 5. But there's something about the way we handle things that sometimes causes conflict and the feedback we have for each other because we're both not wrong, right? Not rushing into something to try to fix it and like take a moment to feel a little bit better is not a bad thing. Just as much as leaning in and trying to get the thing done and trying to fix it is not a bad thing. What happens is when those two people are on the same team and they are not giving feedback appropriately, or they are not sharing in an action step in a similar direction, or they're both not using their skill sets. For me to try to force Jimmy to be strategic, if he's not, is going to put him at a disadvantage because he's going to feel uncomfortable, which is the whole purpose of this Gallup thing, right? And Don Clifton, who founded Strength Finder, I think it was called Strength Quest at that point, but he wanted to study what was right with people. He got out of the army and he started to look at all this stuff of like what was wrong, why you weren't good enough. And he really was like, okay, well, what if we studied the opposite? How to bring people's talents out, how to really innately, like what people are good at, develop those so they can be even better. And I love that. Like there's elements of positive psychology in it. There's elements of solution focused therapy in it. But it's really kind of cool because his whole thing was, why would you spend time working on stuff you're not good at? No, asterisk. Do not get me wrong. You need to absolutely be competent in things so your weaknesses do not overshadow your strengths. But why not develop your strengths more? Right? Like, why wouldn't I lean into being more strategic of things and honing in on that craft so I could bring that to the table? Why wouldn't I hone in on like how to communicate, being a future focused thinker to a room of people who are here and now? Like that to me is a much more worthwhile place and space for us to develop and spend our time in. For organizations, for teams, and for relationships. Again, friends, romantic, partnerships, parenting. Like there's something about that I think is so underutilized. And it goes directly into our feedback. It goes directly into how we give feedback. Now, I was looking around and poking around about, okay, so what does that mean, Daryl? Like, how do we give feedback? What's your point? Strengths, great. I like this from Harvard Business Review. And there's these 7 different things they say to keep in mind when giving feedback. And the first is, what's the point? Or for me, that's what I call it. Like, what's the goal? What's the point? What am I trying to get out of it? Like, is the point for this person to see things my way? Is the point for me to tell this person they did a terrible job? Is the point for me to share an experience that I was uncomfortable with or unsettled with somebody else's behavior? Is the point for me to tell them they're doing a great job and to build rapport? Like, what the fuck is the point? If you do not have a point in your feedback, if you do not know what the feedback is, don't give it. Don't give it. And I know the difference, and I'll use my personal life for an example. I know the difference when I give Jimmy unsolicited feedback because I am just emoting. At that point, it's a criticism, right? I suppose on some level, versus a thoughtful, like, okay, this is the problem. This is how we need to like approach it. This is my feelings. These are your feelings. And that's very different than what you would find in the workplace. But the point being, I can actually feel the difference when I know the purpose of the statement I'm trying to make versus when I'm just talking. And yes, we have our end of year reviews and we have these scheduled things. And I think they're great. I also think leaders can do a much better job at utilizing that time with their teams, with their employees, and with each other. Like, I think truly, if we asked better questions, we would get to solutions, we would get to understandings, we would get to like the future, right? Future focus. We would get to like the future of what we need to do much quicker. So the quality of questions you ask as a way of giving feedback as well can be incredibly important and powerful. Like feedback is not just talking from a vantage point that I'm at. It's also asking questions of like, all right, well, what do you think you do really well? What are your strengths? How can we apply them to this situation? Because you're really good at thing X. Even though thing Y happened, how do we apply this skill set to that to come up with a solution? And all of the research, all of the findings around strengths absolutely show that employees, humans do better with positive feedback. Maybe it's the Sesame Street in us. Maybe it's everybody gets a trophy. Maybe it's everybody gets a sticker. But like, we seek out praise. It's a way to get external validation. Feel however you want about that. Yes, very much so. There is a scale and too much is not good, but also none is also not good. It's not healthy. It's counterintuitive at some point. It can't be all stick and no carrot. Just like it can't be all carrot and no stick. And I'm finding this a lot, especially as I'm working in very traditional and hierarchical organizations, sometimes like surgery, right, is an actually good example of this almost old guard and new guard of how feedback is given in surgery. And it's funny because I hear it a lot and I see it. No feedback is good feedback, according to the old guard. If I'm not telling you anything, it means there's nothing wrong. But think about it. That's a surgical mindset. Why are we going to make a problem? There's no problem to fix. Why are we talking about this? And the new guard, which means like the younger kids or people, not kids, they're not kids, the younger generations, or those who have switched into surgery from a different corporate. We've had lots of artists that have come through Brown, people from really non-traditional finance that have decided to be surgeons, which I think is really cool and adds so much to the culture. But that's really interesting because I do think that there's something to be said about, wait, is this the best way to give feedback? And the rub, I think, comes from, well, in med school, we got feedback on everything and it was instantaneous and it was usually positive. And now here we are in residency and it's not like that. It's very hard sometimes to give instantaneous feedback because, the guy over there in the trauma bay A is coding, so I got to run. I can't give you feedback on that last case. Or I've forgotten about it. Or there were so many moving parts. I wasn't focusing on your part in that. I was also focusing on my part, the anesthesia's part, the scrub tech's part, whatever. I'm rambling. Anyway, all of that to say that it's incredibly interesting when you put intergenerational pieces in this as well of how we give feedback because we were raised on different types of feedback, right? Think about office hours. Think about things like open door policies. Depending on where you are generationally, those things might either feel foreign or bizarre to think as not having a place or a space in your academic or your working kind of role. So feedback intergenerationally is always going to have a bit of a rub because how we communicate intergenerationally is different. Older generations will want to get on the phone. They'll want to have a lunch meeting. They'll want to have a face-to-face. Younger generations are like, text me. And even then, send me an emoji or a meme. Are we good? Like thumbs up, thumbs down? Like where are we at? So again, neither is right or wrong. The problem becomes when we don't recognize it. So there is no formula to feedback. It's more of an exercise in self-awareness, which I love. I love me some self-awareness. So the first things first, what's the point? What's the goal? The next step in this, according to Harvard Business Review, is the feedback tangible? Is it transparent? Meaning like, Am I asking something of you that you can't actually accomplish? Am I asking you to do a deliverable that it's just not going to make sense? Are you going to move 400 units of product by the end of this week and it's a holiday? Probably not, right? So knowing that it needs to be realistic, the things that you're asking. And I tell people all the time, I tell leaders all of the time, when you are giving feedback, make sure you are giving feedback on whatever the problem is, if there's a problem, right? Saying, let's frame it that way, that this feedback happens to be problem-based. Give feedback on the problem rather than the personality, unless the personality is the problem. And there are different ways to structure that. So it needs to be tangible. It also needs to be transparent. Why are we having this conversation? Back to number one, what's the point? What is the point? Also needs to be actionable. Step 3 needs to be actionable. Your feedback needs to have some action. There's nothing worse, and you've probably seen this like romantically or in your friendship groups of like somebody just drops feedback and there's nothing there. It's like, oh God, I can't stand you. It's like, what did I do wrong? Nothing. I just can't stand the way that you act or breathe. Also like unhealthy feedback, by the way. But there needs to be some action because if not, you're just being mean. You're just saying something just to say it. If I can't fix it or if there's nothing there for me to do, why are you saying it? Again, at that point, you need to write it down, put it in your journal, talk to your therapist or your coach about whatever's on your mind. You're allowed to, but there is a difference, right? Feedback and complaining or venting, there has to be action there for feedback to be necessary, for it to be needed. If not, don't give me the feedback if there's nothing I can do about it. It also needs to be user-friendly, meaning we cannot overload people with a million different things to do, or it cannot be too technically detailed. So it can't be above somebody's head, so to speak. So again, let's bring the romantic into it. If you're going to give your partner 15 different pieces of feedback in one conversation, they're not going to do maybe any. And maybe on the high end, they'll do one, or they'll hear one, or they'll grab one message. And this doesn't mean like then slowly drip feedback over the week and keep bombarding them. Like the slow and steady overwhelm is also a real thing. But it needs to be something that you focus on as like, this is where we need to put our investment into. This is the main source, or this is the pattern of behavior that I have seen to be the most impactful to our relationship, to our job, to our team. Again, whatever. Timeliness is also another thing, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Number 5 on the list. Sorry, I can't like count. Whenever I see a list, I will never be able to tell you unless it's number 1 or 2 how far down things are. Anyway, number 5, timeliness. The sooner the better for feedback. It is very difficult to give somebody feedback 4 weeks after something has passed because, to be fair, they might not remember it, or the way that we remember it might have been changed. They say this with kids too in parenting. If you're going to give feedback to your kid, or a punishment, or, like kind of like, ooh, we're not going to do this. It needs to be something immediate so that they get it. If I'm going to say something at the beginning of the week of like, oh, if you don't clean up your room, then we can at the end of the week go here, here, and here. That might be fair to a certain age, but if they're younger, they need immediate feedback. Or 4 days ago, you yelled at dad. That wasn't very nice. Like your kid's going to be like, what? What do you mean? In that moment, it's much better to be like, whoa, hold on. Let's talk about this. Is everything okay? What's happening here? Because we don't speak that way, right? That's feedback. That's a way to address something pretty immediately. In a context of work, it might not always be realistic to give feedback right away. But I think the second you know you need to give the feedback, my advice, unsolicited at this point, you're getting an executive coaching session from me for free here. My advice is give it. Give it the second it comes across your desk, because I don't want you to wait. And there's a way to do it that's tactful and kind and considerate, all of those things. But the immediacy, the timeliness is going to help everybody out. Feedback is also ongoing and consistent. And these are the last 2 points. We're never not going to have feedback. And I think that's so important for us to hear as potential feedback receivers. We're always going to get feedback. And as long as the feedback is something that we're open to, we can very much grow from it. And it also does need to be consistent in terms of like how I deliver feedback, and also maybe when I'm delivering that feedback. So if I'm going to be cool, calm, collected, give my feedback in the quote unquote appropriate ways, and then, quarterly, I give some like unhinged feedback where I'm yelling, I'm screaming, I'm like not being considerate, I'm not being kind. You're not going to trust any of my feedback. And we see this with trust building. We see this with rapport building. It is more important to be consistent than many other things. Not all, but many. So to be consistent means you are showing people, this is who I am. This is how I show up. Yes, there's a little bit of deviation depending on the day, but not so much it seems unhinged, or you're now worried like, oh, what Daryl's going to walk through the door today? Like, you're allowed to be a human and have deviations, but not to the point where it's like, I don't know who I'm going to get, Jekyll or Hyde. Like, that is probably the worst thing that a manager, a leader, even a parent or a partner can do. You want to have some sort of consistency. So again, we just did a lot on feedback, and maybe you think it's sexier than I presented it, maybe not, but hopefully you got something out of it, because I do have seen, and will continue to see, I'm sure, that people that take the time to hone in on these soft skills like feedback, like understanding themselves, their strengths, they develop these things. They take assessment like Clifton Strengths, who's not paying me for this, by the way, although maybe they should, or assessments like that to understand how your brain, your body, or whatever, how it works, how you work. That is a value add. It's so important, because when you can deliver good feedback, you can have more meaningful conversations with anybody in your life. And to me, that is working smarter and not harder. I will leave you this quote because I love it. Does it apply fully? No, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I love this quote because it encompasses so much and it always makes me think. And the quote is, "Honesty without kindness is brutality. Kindness without honesty is manipulative." When I'm thinking about this quote, when you're being kind and not being honest to save somebody's feelings, it absolutely becomes manipulative. And when you are just giving, "I'm just being honest, I'm just trying to tell them the truth," without kindness, it very much can feel like brutality. So I am not suggesting that you are going to fix all of your feedback skills or woes, but maybe this has brought you a little bit more aware and, dare I say, has strategically placed you for thinking about how to maximize and be significant in your future as relating to others. Do you see what I did there? Do you see what I did there? And for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, it's not a black eye. It's just a headbutt from a child. So yeah, I guess it is a black eye. Anyway, I appreciate you all. Thank you for joining us for a solo episode of Feedback and Other F Words. Sorry I didn't have a guest for you this week. I hope in the new year to have many more guests, but absolutely drop me some emails and DMs on what you would like to talk about more on the F word side of things and who we should bring on the show. As always, don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe, and I will see you in a couple of weeks in the new year for new feelings and other F words. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.